climate change doesn't live on an island. We're all impacted by it.
It's really not and shouldn't be a political issue.
Climate One has ensured that indeed many, many different parties have seats at the table.
Every mainstream religion has a mandate to care for creation. We all have a moral responsibility to the future. The way parents have a responsibility for their children.
We all have children or relatives who are very young. Do we not want their world to be good too? Do we not see clearly that what we are doing is not sustainable? And if you do see that, and you continue to deny it for some political reasons, then this is a travesty.
Kids are growing up now, and there's absolutely no question on whether climate change is real, whether climate change is happening, and the question now instead is, what should we do about it?
The future of environmental activism is motivating young people to become civically engaged.
Now more than ever, we need to come together as a culture and a society to address this really important issue.
I am a supreme optimist. I do believe that we can transform ourselves. I do believe that we have the energy, ability, and courage somewhere inside of all of us to do what has to be done.
Thanks for joining us for this live stream conversation with Dr. Vandana Shiva on the hubris of manipulating nature. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area and I would like to acknowledge the Ohlone and Miwok people who inhabited these lands for 10,000 years. We're recording today's conversation for the Climate One radio show and podcast that drops every Friday. You can subscribe wherever you get your pods, and you can submit your questions today in the comment section of the live stream. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Shiva to Climate One from the Commonwealth Club. She's an eco-feminist, advocate for the environment and against corporate-led globalization. She holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Western Ontario, focusing on the philosophy of physics, and is director of the Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology. Dr. Vandana Shiva, welcome to Climate One.
Hello, Greg. Pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure to be with you. During the 1970s, you were active in the grassroots Chipko movement led by women aimed at stopping deforestation in northern India. What drew you to that movement?
Greg, I've grown up in the forests of the Himalaya. I was born in the forests of the Himalaya. My father was a forest conservator. And before leaving for Canada for my PhD in the foundations of quantum theory, I just wanted to carry a bit of my home with me. So I went for a short trek. And this oak forest that I used to walk in had disappeared. And the stream that came from it was a trickle. I was, of course, taking a flight the next day to Canada, so I continued. But while talking waiting on the road for the bus, dhabawala, chaiwala started to talk of how Chipko had started, and now there's hope. And I asked him more, and he knew a little bit about women's action. But I took a pledge in my mind that every vacation I'll come back and I'll meet the people and volunteer for this movement. So that's what I did. Every summer, every winter, I would come back from Canada and volunteered for the Chipko movement. So it's the disappearance of a forest that led me to it. And now while the forests are burning in California, in Canada, I'm thinking of the slogans of the women who never went to school. They defended the oak tree and they sang songs and said, the oak gives us water. The oak leaves become the streams. And they were talking about humus, and they were fighting against monocultures. So the fires of California are not just the climate problem. They are a problem of desiccating the forests with Roundup for a management for timber extraction alone. And the women said these forests are not timber mines. These forests are sources of soil, water, and oxygen. And every day we realize how that is the basis of life. People died during COVID for lack of oxygen. People are dying for lack of water. 1 billion people and more are dying for lack of food. This is exactly the message that women, simple women from the Himalaya were giving. And I say they became my professors of ecology and biodiversity. I did a PhD in Canada, but a non-PhD learning that has lasted me my life from the Chipko University.
So when I want to get back to Chipko, but you said 1 billion people dying from lack of food. That sounds like a bit of an exaggeration. 1 billion people dying?
Oh, 1 billion, 1 billion people are hungry.
And
And given not just undernourished, really denied. If you take the undernourishment figure, there are two sources of undernourishment. One is you don't have access to food. And this is happening also to the farmers who are growing food. Half of the hungry people of the world are agricultural people who are growing rice with chemicals for which they had to borrow money. So when they grow the rice, they have to pay back the agent of the chemical fertilizer and the pesticide and the seed agent. So they grew the rice, but they can't eat it. And when they sell it, it sells for very low. When they buy the same rice, it's 4 times more. This is the polarization of prices that globalization has created. 90% goes to trade. And that means the same farmers who grew the rice starve. The second is the food itself is now nutritionally empty. The data is showing 90% nutrition has gone because the soils are depleted of nutrition. And the nutrition in our food comes from 2 sources. The seeds, we are not breeding for nutrition. We are breeding for weight. It's the ultimate Cartesian victory. How big is the apple? How heavy is your soybean? Not how much nutrition is in. That's why I shifted to nutrition per acre. And we can feed 2 times the world if we conserve biodiversity. The third reason why people are hungry, we are not eating food anymore. It's anti-food. This junk food-like stuff. So 1 billion people are hungry, but 2 billion are sick because of these food-like substances where the industry is growing and stuffing it down. And the American diet is now being spread. And everywhere you have diabetes, you have cancer, you've got metabolic disorders.
Yeah, sometimes I think about, there's a food industry that gets us sick, and then there's a medical industry that wants to sell us drugs after we get sick from the food that is sold to us. Much of your work has been to promote biodiversity in agriculture, just as you articulated, specifically fighting against corporate patents on seeds and the use of GMOs. You've called seed patents biopiracy. How much of your objections are the technologies themselves versus who controls it, the consolidation of power, so much power in few hands?
So Greg, I did my doctorate work on understanding the amazing puzzle that quantum theory is and the 3 elements with which it differs dramatically. That's why we talk about the quantum leap. The quantum leap is the world is not made of things. The world is made of relationships, and relationships means non-separation. So non-locality, non-separability is the key. Second, because it's not made of things with a centralized, fixed quality. Immutable particles is the way Newton talked about the world. No, everything is potential waiting to unfold. And the third is because potential is not fixed, things are uncertain. So uncertainty. Now, these qualities are basically what I brought to understand why Punjab, the land where the Green Revolution had first been implemented in India, globally, Norman Borlaug got the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on Punjab.
Right.
And he called his wheats the miracle wheats. The farmers on the streets of today are the children of the farmers who were on the streets in 84, fighting against the chemical revolution, the Green Revolution, saying, we have been made slaves. And then 87, on the basis of my book, The Violence of the Green Revolution, which has been published by the University of Kentucky Press in the United States, the corporation said, we will now own the seed. We sell the chemicals, not enough profits. We must now own the seed through patents. But to sell the seed and patent it, we must genetically modify it to claim that we've made something new. So in response to your question, the technology and patenting are wedded from birth. So the patenting was the aim. The technology was the means to achieve that aim. The false claim was made that by tweaking one gene or shooting one toxic gene, a BT toxin, a Roundup Ready. We are the inventors and creators of life. And therefore, we own the seed, this seed, and its 20 generations to come. And these are cases that have gone to the Supreme Court. There's a very famous case of Monsanto versus a farmer in US where they actually ruled that the seed is a self-replicating machine. And even if you didn't buy the seed from Monsanto, you bought the grain in an elevator, it is still intellectual property. But having done my doctorate work on non-separation, having done my doctorate work on potential, I said, but the seed is self-organized autopoiesis in making, billions of years of evolutionary history in it. The farmers have bred these seeds, the qualities of the seed, the true qualities, outside the toxic qualities, the aroma of our basmati, the non-gluten properties of our wheats. These weren't created by Monsanto or genetic engineering. They were bred by the farmers. Or the salt-tolerant, flood-tolerance qualities in our rices were not bred by the Gates Foundations, bred by our farmers. So why do I call this biopiracy? Because what nature created, you claim as your creation. And GMO in that worldview means God move over, GMO. God move over. Creation is ours. The second is 10,000 years. You talked about being on the land of people of 10,000 years. All indigenous people, the minimum we can claim is 10,000 years. 10,000 years we farmed. We have bred seeds. One grass, Oryza sativa, became 200,000 rice varieties with the brilliance of Indian peasants. Maize, one teosinte, became the thousands of maize varieties in Mexico and in Peru and in the First Nations of America. That brilliance of breeding is denied. And the corporations say, when I shoot a gene, I create a seed. It is so ontologically wrong, but it's also ethically wrong and epistemologically wrong. So when you ask me, what am I critical of? I'm critical of the worldview of arrogance, the worldview that came with colonialism, the mechanistic mindset of the conquering man being the creator of the earth and creator of the wealth that they basically stole. So, you know, there's a way in which in our age, the religion that was the colonizing mission, you know, the first colonization, or you got to be a Christian, all those little kids from the indigenous peoples, the First Nations, thrown into boarding schools, thousands died. The graves are just being found. That was all to make them civilized through Christianity. Mm-hmm. Today's civilizing mission is use the mysterious word technology, but technology is merely a tool. At any point, humanity is brilliant enough to have 5, 10, 20 tools to choose from. That is technological democracy. And the minute you put technology at the level of religion with a capital T in the hands of 5 men, then that's when hubris substitutes democracy.
And one of the biggest seed controversies has been over golden rice, a variety of genetically engineered to provide vitamin A. According to the WHO, vitamin A deficiency is responsible for 1 to 2 million deaths a year, plus another 500,000 cases of blindness. This sounds like a pretty good idea to fortify rice with vitamin A.
Well, it would be a good idea, Greg, if there was no other source of vitamin A. One, you know, when you need vitamin A, what do you eat? You eat curcumin. Why is vitamin A the precursor called beta carotene? Carrot is where
leafy greens, right? But if it was so readily available, then people, you know, if it's so readily available, then there wouldn't be such a vitamin A deficiency. Right?
So why is there a vitamin A deficiency? Let's go back to the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, who took mixed farming with lots of vegetables, lots of greens, lots of pulses, lots of oil seeds, and then said, no, I want to sell my fertilizers, the leftovers of the war. And therefore, we must have monocultures. When you have an external input system, you have to have a monoculture.
And those fertilizers are based on fossil fuels, partly, right?
They're based on fossil fuels. 1 kilogram of urea fertilizer requires 2 liters equivalent of diesel. The same technique was used to make explosives in Hitler's Germany. And the same companies made the explosives and ammunition and made the fertilizers. But it's the same buyers. And you talked earlier about some of them make us sick and then others make a profit. It's the same people who make us sick. The poison cartel came out of Hitler's Germany. The poison cartel is the big pharma. And they make you sick, and then they have the patented medicine. But coming back to the issue of vitamin A deficiency, so you create monocultures. And what is Roundup? Roundup, as the debates in the Biodiversity Convention used to show, Monsanto would get up and say, we prevent the weeds from stealing the sunshine. Well, the sun is so generous, and it grows biodiversity. The beautiful amaranth, which has been made a superweed with Roundup-resistant soya and Roundup-resistant corn in the fields of America, and now they're using dicamba and more virulent herbicides. What was called weeds are sources of food, are sources of vitamin A. But the second big reason is that when you do so-called high-yielding varieties with chemical fertilizers, first, your high-yielding variety is merely taking more out of the farm, destroying the straw, which would go back to the soil to make the nutrition. You've destroyed the nutrition cycle of the earth. You've destroyed the nutrients in the soil, the zinc, the iron, everything else that makes us healthy. So you're having nutritionally empty food. So you have a monoculture, you have nutritionally empty food. Then you do milling. Industrial milling is a way to take nutrition out. But they're so clever, then they sell the bran as a separate product. They sell rice bran oil as another product. So they dismember a product which you would eat in wholesome ways. And the data is there. When women hand pound the rice, it's far more nutritious. When you don't polish it, it's far more nutritious. But the fourth reason, the golden rice, is, as I called it, in 2000, in 2000, they started to announce it. And we removed it from India because of the falsehood. We said there's so many more alternatives. And I called it the blind approach to blindness prevention. Blind because they're much more superior alternatives. And two, that this is not a proven technology. 20 years later, they're still trying. And the false vitamin A added externally through genetic engineering evaporates. It doesn't stay in the rice. So it's a dysfunctional system to make more and more money for a few people. And we have watched how to dump GMO soya on India. The industry just ganged up and banned our edible oils. They banned our local cold press virgin milks, 5 million just made illegal overnight. And it's the women who came to me and said, bring back our mustard. We cannot eat food cooked in GMO soya. And we had to do a satyagraha. Satyagraha is Gandhi's word of non-cooperation. Satya, truth, agrah, force. He taught us how to throw the British out. He fought in South Africa against the regime there.
Called the Gandhi of grain. So I certainly see that capitalism is about creating revenue streams, and intellectual property helps lock up technology that secures revenue streams and therefore profits for the capitalistic system. But the systems you're describing are so entrenched and complex. How do we change them? Some people would say organics are more nutritious and counter many of the things you're talking about. Others would say organics require too much land, that organics cannot scale and feed the world.
So, there was the word, when Europe was the center of the world, we used to talk about the Eurocentric worldview. And I think now that the US thinks it's the center of the world, there's a very American-centric worldview. But most of the farms of the world are not like what has been made of the American farmlands. Agribusiness has destroyed farming in America, and the Green Revolution, the second Green Revolution, globalization, World Trade Organization, Agreement on Agriculture, intellectual property rights, phytosanitary measures, all of these are systems to Americanize the world's food system. So let me just run through 3 or 4 sets of figures for you. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, 80% of the food we eat today comes from small farms. Large farms do not feed the world. They only bring us 20% of the food we eat, but they use 75% of the land. So small farms that give us 80% food use only 25% land. So they use it far more efficiently. All the data is showing, and I have a book called Who Really Feeds the World that was written for the Expo in Milan, whose theme was Feeding the World. Small farms produce more. Our work in Navdanya, and for those who want to visit Navdanya, Navdanya, which means 9 seeds as well as the new gift, biodiversity produces more because it works in cooperation. So the more you intensify chemicals, you intensify commodity production, which doesn't feed you. But the more you intensify biodiversity, the more you intensify the flows of nutrition in a system, the soil regenerates, the plants regenerate, the pollinators come back, and you actually have more nutrition per acre rather than yield per acre. So this debate that's been created, oh, you'll need more land, is a false debate. It's chemical farming that needs more land. It's commodity farming that needs more land. Otherwise, why would the soya lobby had invaded into the Amazon just to grow GMO soya? Most of it for animal feed and biofuel. The expansionism of GMO soya should tell anyone that this is not about feeding the world, but it is feeding profits. Most importantly, when the authenticity of food and the relationship between soil and plants and our body, our gut microbiome is disrupted, and a commodity is a commodity is a commodity, it doesn't matter if it ran your car, it tortured your animals in a factory farm, or it tortured your gut microbiome with bad food, with glyphosate residues that totally disrupt your 100 trillion companions in your gut microbiome. So food, I think, is going to be the place where the shift will come, but most of the world does the right kind of farming, and it is resisting globalization. This is why I joined the movement against globalization. We created the International Forum on Globalization. We stopped the WTO in Seattle. Basically, we said our world is not for sale and small farmers feed the world. This is the subject of the debate because the food summit has been hijacked, taken from Rome to New York, taken from the UN system with one country, one code, to basically Bill Gates and his appointees and the poison cartel and the buyers and the junk food makers. Fascinating moments we live in, the very basis of our existence, our health, our being. We are what we eat. That itself is being hijacked, stolen.
And climate is disrupting agriculture, small scale agriculture, large scale agriculture. A lot of small scale agriculture, as you know, is done by women. Is there technology that can help provide food security and help women farmers? Isn't some of that positive? What kind of technology can you see helping?
So Greg, I think the first issue is it's not just that agriculture is being impacted by climate change. Industrial globalized agriculture based on fossil fuels and fossil fuel based chemicals is 50% of the climate problem. The figures are there. It just usually they look at only agricultural production. But in agriculture production itself, when you see those giant machines moving, they're all fossil fuel driven. When you see the urea applied to the fields, it's emitting nitrous oxide, which is 300 times more damaging to the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And it is the planetary boundary most ruptured. I do not know why nitrogen is not in the discussion on climate change. But the production problem is 15% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Destroying forests.
Right, deforestation.
The Amazon,
piece. Yeah.
Land use change and deforestation is 15 to 20% of the greenhouse gases. And it's not just livestock, it's the GMO soya, it's the palm oil. I think that's where people need to become a little more thinking. The third is processing. Why are we taking good, healthy food and turning it into junk that makes us sick and destroys the planet? Ultra-processed food is the single biggest cause of chronic diseases, which are making us more vulnerable to infections like COVID. And infections are coming to us from the forest, 300 new infectious diseases, because humans have invaded into the forest largely for agribusiness and its profits. So processing, we could do with much less and more artisanal. Transport, we don't have to move food miles. We called it food miles. This shipping containers of grain and vegetables across the world, we need to localize more. Packaging, 75% of the waste, whether it's plastic or styrofoam, all of that, most of it is food. And then retail, Mr. Jeff Bezos just went for 10 minutes into space all over the place. Comes down and says two things that everyone should be outraged with. All listeners of Climate One should be outraged with. The first, he says, oh, now after my 10-minute ride, we can put all the polluting industry into other planets.
Yeah,
Are you crazy? Are you crazy? You've destroyed this planet, and you with your shipping of one parcel for one hairpin are a big polluter. No one has done the ecological footprint of Amazon distribution. But more importantly, he sits there arrogantly and says, while people are fighting for fair wages, workers' compensation, he sits there and says, I want to thank all the customers and workers of Amazon who sent me for a 10-minute flight to space. That irresponsibility is the hubris. So
And Stephen Colbert says he just wants, Stephen Colbert just said he wants Jeff Bezos to pay some taxes, start there. But, okay.
But let me complete the figures of the emissions from industrial globalized agriculture, not agriculture, but industrial globalized agriculture. 20% from turning food into rubbish. That is destroying the planet and our health. And then because you're privileging long distance movement and uniformity, you have waste. If I'm growing food locally, there's no waste. I can feed my cow, I can compost it. No food goes waste. But long distance transport makes waste. This is 50% of the greenhouse gases. Now, when you ask me, is there technology? That's where I think for the Western industrial civilization, the big quantum leap in their minds has to be technology is any transformation. Yeah. So when a peasant breeds seeds, they are involved in breeding technology. Breeding doesn't begin with Monsanto poisoning the seed. When a leaf, a beautiful leaf, takes the sunlight and the carbon dioxide and through photosynthesis transforms this into the oxygen that we breathe and keeps us alive, and the carbohydrates that are the basis of all the food and fiber of the world. That is the most sophisticated technology for taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, putting it into plants, turning it into food, putting it back into soil, turning it into fertile soils. Our assessments, the community that created the regeneration movement, we have the Regeneration International. All the scientists who are working on the link between the biosphere and the atmosphere are showing that if we stop fossil fuels today and don't need to new emissions, and I do believe polluters should pay and not make tricks through like net zero, we can talk about that later. Mm-hmm. But we basically can, if we stop the pollution in agriculture, if we stop the chemicals in a 10-year time frame, the chemicals and the fossil fuels, and make small farms, we can feed the world, regenerate more wilderness, we can have more nourishment, other beings can come back and have their habitats. But most importantly, we can do this all in 10 years. 10 tons is the amount we can add every year. The research is showing this. And on our farm at Navdanya, we do these studies on how with biodiversity intensification, intensifying photosynthesis, biomass, biodiversity, you can actually heal the cycle and regenerate rather than degenerate the planet.
Let me jump in here and remind Dr. Vandana Shiva is an ecologist, activist, author, and director of the Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology. We're talking about the hubris of manipulating nature. I'd like to ask you, Dr. Shiva, I was quite relieved when I received my first and second COVID-19 vaccine. Have you been vaccinated? I know that was quite bad in India.
I've been vaccinated, but the data is not very reassuring. In England, more people have died who were vaccinated than those who were
Well,
not.
but
So
that could be confusing causation and correlation, because someone vaccinated and died, they could have died from a heart attack or cancer or something else. It doesn't mean that and this is, I think, the kind of statement that sometimes causes people to say you're anti-science, because
No. But the point is, we could apply the same to COVID, because as the data showed very clearly, and I wrote this in my ecological reflections of the coronavirus, literally as I was rushing back when the COVID struck. If you get an infection, you have less than a 1% mortality risk. But if bad food and junk food that's also given you climate change has given you diabetes and a metabolic disorder, the risks of your mortality, the comorbidities, increases to 9.2%. If the toxics in your food that were put in there by the poison cartel, who will also send you the cancer drug, if you have cancer, the risks are 7.6% increase. So, of course, all living systems change. Is not a one-dimensional Cartesian cause effect. I think that is another thing we must. One is
sure. If you have diabetes, you're at higher risk. The COVID vaccine.
But there's multi-causation.
Sure.
In any system, and therefore we need to look at the system as a whole, and that's why people like Fritz of Capra, who was also a physicist and has written amazing books and is in the Bay Area. We talk of system science, and system science means all relationships must be taken into account. And Cartesian logic is what is the block to understanding both the causes of climate change and their impacts,
many factors,
understanding disease, multifactorial, and therefore we talk of four-dimensionality, the three dimensionals of space, not just the two-dimension of Cartesian space, and time unfolding. The four together, space-time are one time. Space-time are one continuum. Einstein taught us that. So I think 400 years later, we are still stuck with a linear, one-dimensional, mechanistic paradigm which says the nature is dead. One thing has one impact. And Mr. Descartes, whom we are still following, said, I'm a thinking thing without a body, and we are making our body sick. We are making the planet's body sick because of a wrong paradigm that suited colonization.
And we're not taught that in school. But back to the COVID vaccines are mRNA vaccines. They teach our cells how to make a protein that triggers an immune response inside our bodies. You've received it. I've received it. Is that manipulation of cellular protein?
No. Yeah, again, you're Americanizing the world. America has some vaccines. India has others. We have Covishield and we have Covaxin. So I do think, like the Eurocentric obsession that the whole world will be shaped by a European mind.
So you have a different
I do think
vaccine.
you have to learn to be Earth citizens in America. And when you cite so beautifully, all of you, I am on the land of these nations. I think we need to make that real, that there were indigenous cultures before the white man came. There are indigenous cultures all over the world. There are sovereign countries making decisions on seed, food, agriculture, medicine, vaccines. Most of the countries don't have patents on seed. I've helped our parliament write laws. Seeds are not human inventions, therefore they cannot be patented. Our laws, and my sister was a big player in the patent law on medicine, that changing a little thing and evergreening doesn't give you a patent. You have to make something totally new. So countries like India have sovereign laws, and we are the biggest vaccine makers of the world, but we also have sovereign decisions about which vaccines we will choose.
Fair enough. And India is now the world's third largest emitter of carbon dioxide after the US and China. Granted, India is still living in the shadow of colonialism. What responsibility there's also a rising middle class in India and China that is aspiring to higher levels of consumption, material comforts. What responsibility does China have? What responsibility does India have with regard to its own emissions?
Well, I think the first thing is we need to remember that while we are politically sovereign, globalization made the economic system one integrated corporate production machine, which outsourced everything at that time to China, which is why 90% of Walmart's production
Sure. So,
was taking place in China.
Emissions
So-
were exported. Emissions, manufacturing and emissions were exported.
Exported.
Sure, right.
So that is why it's wrong to talk merely about consumers. We got to look at the production system. We got to look at the corporate role. There's a very good new report out on whose share, and beginning with the agreements on climate, 85% of the increased pollution is from the G8 countries, the industrialized countries, if you take their share of production into account, not the geography. And, I don't know if you followed Lawrence Summers at the Earth Summit, where he said, oh, the third world doesn't have enough pollution, and we must export pollution to them and shift our polluting industry like Jeff Bezos wants to shift polluting industry to other planets. He said, first, it'll be cheaper to manufacture. We'll make more profits. Second, when they get sick, it'll be cheaper because costs are lower. And third, this is where we fought him on the genocide, arithmetic of genocide. He said, when they die, their deaths will be less costly. But all lives are equal. So this idea of exporting toxics, exporting pollution, exporting waste is based on basically a racist divide, an apartheid, that you take the sickness. And this is the debate of environmental justice and climate justice all over the world.
Sure, that definitely happened. Exporting manufacturing, exporting the emissions, and there are still rising middle class that have their own domestic indigenous, their own domestic emissions, and that is part of it. There's 300 million people who've come out of poverty into the middle class in China. I don't know how many in India, and that is a real force for growing emissions. Most of the historic emissions are red, white, and blue, which means they're French and British and Russian and American. But there is, I'm trying to get to the point of, a lot can be blamed on colonialism, a lot can be blamed on exportation and globalization, which may be driven by the forces you cite. But what responsibility do emerging economies have? They have some, don't they?
So, yeah, great. So if I have a vegetable vendor outside my door and I just step out and buy my fresh tomatoes and my fresh cucumbers, and that option is destroyed because Mr. Jeff Bezos comes and shifts everything so that during the lockdown, the vegetable vendor is not able to sell, but Mr. Bezos continues to sell. And these are debates, they're ongoing debates right now
By
on
delivery,
retail.
you can
Yeah,
get the
on retail
vegetables
issue. So, and it's not just that, it's other issues. The point is the global corporate industry has outsourced production to lower costs. The software industry made $40 billion additional profits by shifting software to India, in Hyderabad, in Bangalore. But the second is they manipulate laws to make the local option illegal. When I gave you the story of our little virgin cold press oils that have zero emissions, and a middle class gets pure good cold pressed virgin oil. If I hadn't done the civil disobedience, we wouldn't be having cold pressed mustard oil. We wouldn't be having cold pressed coconut oil. We wouldn't be having cold pressed linseed oil. It took a civil disobedience to get the Monsantos and the Cargills reduce their monopoly. They still have a very large market. So when you talk consumption, Greg, it is extremely important to think about forced consumption. Forced consumption in food, it is always forced. The second is, we are a land of clothing. India was colonized for its spices and textiles. But you think changing in the clothing system is not part of the fast fashion industry's big propaganda machine? When, consumers are not little atoms by themselves. They are, when they are made unthinking consumers of advertising signals and options that are closed for them, they will make choices that suit the profits of the corporate world. When they are free citizens who are able to think culturally in their civilization, able to think about the footprint of their actions. That's why I talk about earth democracy. That's why I talk about earth citizenship rather than consumerism. Again, we come back to Mr. Descartes, yeah? We separate consumers from production, but it's one system. We separate corporate profits from the choices consumers make. Why are the young people of the world rebelling? They're seeing the links. The fact that young people are on the streets and striking is they are seeing the links.
Yeah, and some they even object to the identification of people as consumers. You're defined by what you buy. Even that whole notion of consumers rather than people or individuals. I remember one moment when I was interviewing Barack Obama was supporting the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I was interviewing his ambassador promoting, Michael Foreman, promoting that deal, and a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors came in and said, please don't do this, because under TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, local regulations protecting restricting the sale of tobacco to young people could be seen as an obstruction to trade. And so Donald Trump did away with the TPP. Do you agree with that one thing that you think that Donald Trump did well?
But I, basically think that globalization and free trade, whether it is the World Trade Organization or the TPP or the Atlantic Treaty or the bilaterals being worked out, are really corporate rule. That's how we call it in the International Forum on Globalization. Now, when corporations write the rules, they will write rules against democracy. They will write rules against constitutions. They will write rules against the environment. They will write rules against workers' rights. And these are rules of deregulation. So what you've just cited is part of all the new free trade agreements, the interstate dispute settlement mechanism. And this is wonderful, right? Just like Columbus got a charter or East India Company got a charter saying, go take those lands. They write their treaties and then say all of this is ours for profit. And if a government makes a decision according to its constitution and according to its people's will, then we will sue them for stealing our markets that don't exist, but they are our right. And I'll give you just two examples. You gave the example of tobacco, but you remember after Fukushima, the Germans were out on the street and they insisted that all their nuclear plants be phased out. And Germany had to take that decision under huge democratic pressure. So the nuclear plant was shut, and Vattenfall, a Swedish company which had a nuclear plant, sued Germany billions of dollars that we have lost so much profits, now you pay us. So these interstate dispute settlement clauses are basically, we'll sit at home, we'll write a treaty. The violation of that treaty, because the constitution doesn't allow it or the people don't allow it, will be, we will harvest. I'll give you one more example. I've been part of the movement for water as a commons and against water privatization. And we stopped the privatizing of the Ganga by Suez. The World Bank was trying to push it. Again, we did civil disobedience. We marched the streets. I brought water pots to the World Bank. Zolik was the president. He wanted to meet me, and I gave him a little pot. But Bolivia's water was privatized by the World Bank, and it was given to Bechtel, which is the American company. And Bechtel, of course, increased the prices 6 times. But when people started to harvest on their rooftops, they said, even the rain, you cannot harvest. When people started to dig wells, so they wouldn't have to pay huge prices, they said, even the groundwater is ours.
Yeah, I think there was a movie made about that one. Yeah. So,
so and the fact that indigenous people then came into governance is because of that movement of people in Bolivia. Well, Bechtel was thrown out, but Bechtel is still demanding compensation. So corporate rule is the problem.
Well,
corporate rule is the problem.
They have contracts, and I may agree with you about how corporations have assumed an unhealthy amount of power, our international system, legal system, having the rights of individuals. And yet the climate emergency is urgent. It is severe. It is affecting everyone. And there are some corporations that are using their power to move away from fossil fuels toward cleaner energy. We may not like the system, but isn't it good that some large corporations are moving toward cleaner energy? Isn't that a positive force? Are corporations always bad? Is everything big bad?
Well, everything big where there is a small as an alternative is not the most desirable option. Yeah. So, again, sadly, the energy question has been reduced to an external input system. Just like in agriculture, where you give organic matter to the soil and then the soil organisms make your fertility, the soil is living. We forgot the soil is living. We forgot that the plants are living. We forgot that the earth as a whole, Gaia, is living.
So you're challenging the way I'm asking the question, because I asked the question about shouldn't we change the energy inputs, and you're saying that that's a simplistic, linear, Cartesian way to look at the system. I should be looking more holistically, systemically. That you're challenging my narrow
No, I'm
question.
talking about we've been given, because of corporate rule and a fossil fuel civilization, a highly centralized external input system for everything we do. Whether it is how we produce things, including our food. We just went through the discussion, how 50% of the greenhouse gases come from an agriculture where fossil fuels and chemicals were made central. We can shift to a fossil fuel free and a poison free agriculture. This is what I've done 37 years of my life. We produce more food, we regenerate soil health, we brought back biodiversity. We have 6 times more pollinators in our farm than in the forest next door. Our water level has come up 70 feet. We don't do one thing, we do many things. And
is that economically viable? Is that economically
Of course it is. Our farmers, will tell you a title of a book. We've done a true cost accounting book called Wealth per Acre, because we were always told farmers make more in a chemical system. We did the true cost accounting. What does a farmer growing BT cotton earn? What does a farmer growing organic cotton earn? What does a farmer growing millets earn? What does a farmer growing soya bean earn? And on an average, if the farmers have their own seed, if the farmers have their own ecological agriculture production with internal input systems, if the farmers have economic sovereignty to shape the market, where we need the bigness of the global market to step out of this way, because we have local markets, farmers have to eat. When you shift that, the farmers are earning 10 times more than those participating in the production of chemical commodities for a global supply chain. So yes, farmers earn more, but you have to do a true cost accounting, and you have to change your measures, because the problem with globalization is it only measures trade. It doesn't measure production. The problem with the economy anyway that came out of commerce, colonial commerce, is it basically says if you produce what you consume, you don't produce. And this is how nature's production was wiped out. This is how women's production was turned to zero. And this is how peasant production, which is what feeds the world, was reduced to zero. So we have too many false assumptions in our systems. And once we shift out of them, and you can only shift out of them by looking at the big picture, what we find is the inevitability that the bigness of the problem requires big corporate control as a solution, when the solution lies in decentralized democratization of the food system, the energy system, the mobility system, the urban systems. And those are the initiatives taking place all over the world. All I'm saying is, let's not assume bigness as an inevitability. The only thing where bigness, where you don't know when to stop growing, that bigness, the only entity that has that property outside corporations is the cancer cell. Every other cell knows how much to grow and when to die off and be replaced. So bigness is not a virtue. Schumacher, brilliant thinker, worked a lot in India, and I teach at the Schumacher College in England when travel is possible. Schumacher said, and wrote a book called Small is Beautiful. This through true economic assessments, that we produce more in the small. We produce more in the decentralized. We have more democracy. We have more diversity. We have more respect for the earth and each other. So let's not begin with...
Certainly small businesses are the backbone of the U.S. economy. And speaking of small, you said that individuals should never give up their power. Yet in the face of climate change, many people, even those with institutional power, feel inadequate. So what do you say to regular people who think they have no power to affect something so colossal as these systems you're talking about?
Well, I would basically say to ordinary people that the havoc, I've never called it climate change because climate change makes you think in a comfortable way. And now temperature will rise in this way. No, look at the floods in Europe.
Climate disruption, climate chaos, sure.
I call it climate chaos. From the beginning, when I wrote my book, Soil Not Oil, I called it climate chaos. You don't know where the next extreme event will take place and what its form will be. There is no model, no matter how big your supercomputers be, they cannot catch up.
We're certainly seeing that this summer with floods and fires. It's devastating.
So the three things is, I think all of us should have a deeper understanding that the disruption of the Earth's climate systems comes from not just the use of fossilized material, which the Earth buried over 600 million years, and it should have been left underground, but the way it fossilized our mind. To me, that's the serious question. Yeah, it fossilized our mind to imagine that this is the only way things can work. But once we get out of the fossil carbon
how do we retrain our minds?
We retrain our minds by moving from the mechanistic mind and the monoculture of the mind to the ecological mind and the diversity of the mind. And that is available in the science, it's available in cutting edge science, and it's available in all indigenous cultures. All indigenous culture. And it's available in the will of women to sustain community and the earth in spite of patriarchy. That's why I always say, women will show the way. And if there is a future, it's because women are showing the way. So women, indigenous people, and Gaia herself, the earth, we've got to learn much more, to listen to them, to learn from them. The second is, if you look at the images of Germany, what was happening? The floods came, and if you look at the pictures, where was the worst flooding? Where American-style agriculture has created barren large fields, and a storm, and then the mud, the soil erosion takes place. We're turning the planet into a dust bowl. And when you have extreme rain events, a dust bowl creates floods. When a dust bowl is dry, it creates dust storms, but it creates the kind of floods that we are seeing with mudslides. People were helping each other. So we need much more solidarity. We need much more community building. And third, we need much more multi-layered governance. We need to reclaim the power of community. We need to reclaim the power of the local. We need to reclaim the power of the regional governments. We definitely need to reclaim both the responsibility and the rights of our sovereign governments, who cannot be prevented and should not be prevented from doing the right thing. There's new false solutions coming from global corporations who say only we have the money. Only we have the money, only we can solve the problem. And they just floated this idea of net zero, and Bill Gates has it in his book, Net Zero. And they say it so clearly, we'll continue to pollute. Net zero doesn't mean zero pollution. It doesn't mean we'll end pollution, which is the principle. A polluter should stop polluting and should pay for the damages caused by past pollution. And, and Greg, the figures, they talked about 100 billion, which they haven't paid in the climate fund. But
That's
every year,
Right.
But every year we have damages that are more than 700 billion, 800 billion, and they're going to keep growing with every disaster. So the polluters should be picking up this. When they want to show off their money should be, polluters should pay. But most importantly, this net zero is, on the one hand, they're saying we won't reduce our pollution. We'll still have our private jets. We'll still fly around. We'll still do global production. And when I want to go into space, I'll still go into space. But you will adjust to be our offsets.
Are you going to adjust? Do you still fly yourself?
Well, we can't fly anyway, but I don't think I wouldn't. I think that time is over. I'm anyway a very senior citizen, Greg. And I think at some point, it's a good moment to make a shift. And I'm talking to you across
from India
the ocean.
Sure.
On
Zoom, right.
And then, I'm able to give much more attention to the conservation work, the biodiversity work on Navdanya Farm, or to our colleagues. I've just spent a week with our colleagues from across India on how not only will we continue our biodiverse conservation, we'll continue our organic farming, we'll continue building local markets, but we are working with farmers becoming the climate guards so that the reports on the impact of the damages and the reports on the experience of resilience, which seeds are resilient, with organic practices are resilient, that people emerge from the ground as climate experts. That's our next decade of work.
And speaking of gods, you see environmental destruction as inherently patriarchal. I was a little surprised to see you praise Laudato Si, the encyclical from Pope Francis on care for our common home that urged a move away from consumerism. The Catholic Church is a pinnacle of patriarchy. So are there powerful white men you think are positive forces on climate and perhaps even have feminine sensibilities?
You know, including in the preparations of the encyclical on dialogues on technology and dialogues on economy. And he basically talked about, you know, going beyond the economics of indifference. And yet, I mean, I've written so much about the fact that Pope Alexander wrote the papal bull to conquer the lands. The Pope before him wrote the bull to burn 9 million people as witches just because they believed we are part of nature. And, you know, being part of nature was made illegal. You were engaged in witchcraft if you thought you were part of nature. You had to separate yourself. So the burning of witches, colonialism, all goes hand in hand. I do believe very sincerely, and again, I come back to my quantum training, everyone has potential. You know, it's not the fact that you're born white and you're stuck in white superiority. The potential to be Earth citizens is in you. The fact that popes and the church has been part of the crimes against humanity over history doesn't mean a current pope doesn't have a potential to realize that he can correct the church. And the encyclical is a correction. Yeah. So potential means all of us can be Earth citizens, equal but diverse. All of us can be feminist, men and women. All of us can be indigenous. And that's the major shift we need to make. And if we are able to make that leap from monocultures to diversity, from superiority to equality, from destruction as creation to co-creation in nonviolence, then humanity has a hope.
We have as we get toward the end here, we have a question from an audience member watching this live stream, and Sally says, I would like Dr. Shiva to say something hopeful or anything that is good. She is depressing me. This is from Reverend Sally.
Yeah. So Reverend Sally, I have spent my lifetime looking at destruction and doing what creates hope. So we have saved seeds, and I call them seeds of hope. We've saved more than 5,000 seed varieties, seeds that can tolerate cyclones and floods and drought. And this is what farmers are using today as a commons, not patented. So seeds of hope are where hope comes. Organic farming allows you to hold much more water. It's the answer to drought. People are talking about the Californian drought. All you need to do is, if you were to make all of California organic, if your forests stop spraying Roundup, tomorrow the wildfires would stop. You'd have humus, and you would have
there's a lot of fuel, there's a lot of dry, there's a lot of, I mean, I don't know that Roundup would stop the fires, because there's a lot of fuel and a lot of drought and a lot of winds, a lot of heat.
But the point is, you have created an inflammable system, so the tiniest damage makes it catch the fire. What is resilience? Resilience is increasing ecological immunity of ecosystems, health immunity of your bodies. And so not only do we sow seeds of hope, we plant gardens of hope where we grow more food, we become one with the earth, we heal the soil, and we realize human is derived from humus. And it brings back our humility and takes us away from hubris.
So as we wrap up, I just want to mention on GMOs. I hear your points about control and the mindset and the worldview. Though the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the British Royal Society have all examined the evidence and concluded that consuming foods containing ingredients derived from GM crops are no riskier than consuming the same foods containing ingredients from plants modified by conventional improvement techniques. So acknowledging all the things you said about GMOs and control and power, would you acknowledge that as a scientist, GMOs are safe for humans to eat?
But we never even started talking about it as food. We were talking about it in the field as a crop. And the reason I played a big role in writing, working with governments to write Article 19.3 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which led to the Biosafety Protocol, on which I was appointed as an expert for framing the protocol. Biosafety is about the impact on biodiversity. What does it do? What does Bt, toxin, do to the bees and the butterflies? What does Bt toxin do to the soil organisms? So the impact on biodiversity, the impact on public health, and now added to it is the socio-economic impact on farmers. In India, we've lost 400,000 farmers to suicide. 85% of them, this is from government data. You just have to do the Bt cotton map, the GMO map, and map the suicides. 85% are in the cotton area, 95% of it Monsanto.
And I read a book, I did read a Brookings Institution report that said that per capita, you know, kind of questioning with some of the trends of the Indian farmer suicides. So there is some debate there. Tragic, there is some debate about whether it's out of proportion to other countries, et cetera. But that is certainly something that's very serious.
But let me come back to the GMO question. To talk about food means it's all right if you lose your biodiversity. I think the biosafety question is about the relationship of the crops we grow. And the evidence is now so clear that GMO crops have failed to do what they were claimed to do. Roundup ready crops were introduced in order to control weeds. American farmlands are overtaken by superweeds. Half of the farmlands. Palmer amaranth wasn't a weed. In India, Bt toxin was supposed to be a solution to pesticides. 135 farmers died in 2017 spraying pesticides because of pesticide poisoning on a crop that was supposed to have pests. We have more pests because, as I come back to the system state, a plant is a self-organized complex system. One gene of toxics makes the plant more vulnerable to new pests. And the weeds are intelligent. They evolve resistance, just like antibiotics. Resistance is growing. The more antibiotics you use in your animal farms and your factory farming, you're going to have antibiotic resistance. So we have to come back again to the science of living systems. The technology, where it was applied, has failed. I don't think big scientific institutions should be looking at the wrong place. We are talking about crops and biodiversity. No one talked about food safety. And in the early days, of course, no one died of DDT immediately. Rachel Carson was attacked because she pointed out the harm. Today we know. So neither GMOs nor chemicals have instant impact. The impact builds up over time. But on life on Earth, it does have impact. In poisons kill immediately and are the basis of the extinction crisis. So anyone who cares about diversity of species should be looking at the tools that are driving species to extinction, including tools like GMOs that have increased use of extermination chemicals by 15 times in the US, much more in Latin America, much more in Argentina, much more in Brazil. So again, we have to think in systems ways. We have to think in interconnections.
Thank you, Dr. Shiva. I'd like to give a shout out as we wrap up to the Climate One team for making this happen. Adam, Arnav, Ariana, Kelly, and Tyler, thank you. You're a great team. On Climate One today, we've been discussing the hubris of manipulating nature with Indian activist Vandana Shiva. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your podcast. Talking about climate can be hard and depressing. It can also be exciting and really interesting. So please give us a rating or review on those applications. It really does help advance the climate conversation. Thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time, everybody.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you to the team.
Thank you, Dr. Shiva.